Closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
The mental health system in Illinois, is it broken? And if so, how can it be fixed? That's the focus of our discussion today on The Professors. Joining us today to talk about Illinois' mental health system are Dr. John Shustisky, professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Temple Hemphill, professor at Kennedy King College, and Dr. Larry Lichtenstein, professor and manager of the Wellness Center at Kennedy King College. Welcome all.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so John, I know you also sit on the Illinois Mental Health Advisory Council, correct?
I do.
And so, speaking cautiously, can you help give us a sense of what's the landscape of mental health in Illinois?
Well, CM, I think there's good news and there's bad news. As a field, there have never been better answers for mental health treatment. We know how to help people. We can provide for them if we have the resources. And Illinois, like so many states, has had a difficult time allocating sufficient resources to the services that we know work. Treatment works, people get better, and we ought to find a way for folks to have access to that treatment. Mm-hmm. In Illinois, the funding for mental health from 2009 to 2012 decreased by 30%. There's 30% less funding available. The decision makers are being creative. We're looking for ways to provide the best possible services, but we know that more people need help than are able to get help. The kinds of help we can provide cannot be supported by the limited funds available, and that the impact on the community and on individual lives is great if services are not available. We know that when folks cannot get treatment, their life is not as full as it could be. Mm-hmm. Folks turn more frequently to the hospital emergency rooms or other sources that are far more expensive than treatment would be. We know that untreated folks may find their way to the criminal justice system or juvenile justice system. It just doesn't make sense to not provide adequate funding for mental health services. And so I think one of the important messages from today has to be that treatment works, we need to make help available, and all of us needs to make sure that our state legislators and our members of Congress know that this has to be a high priority. Even in difficult times, we need to find the resources to support mental health care.
Okay, so Larry, I want you to glean from what John has said, and he's really made some very, very valuable points.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about why should we care? We've got like he said, there's a 30% reduction in funding. In Chicago, there has been literally a 50% reduction in the Chicago public health facilities that offer the mental treatment. So why should we care?
In addition to the strain on the other services such as emergency rooms, we've heard from Sheriff Dart recently about how the county jails are becoming overstocked with people with mental illness. The families of people who need help get very stressed about this, and there's a ripple effect through families and friends who feel obligated to sometimes leave their jobs, to do other things with their lives that are less productive than what they could be in order to help these people who are having difficulties. Here at Kennedy King, for example, at the Wellness Center, we help many students who may not be able to get through school without that help, and therefore they are not able to be as productive members of society, caretakers for their own families as they would be otherwise. And part of the answer is early identification, early treatment before problems get to be overwhelming for individuals, causing them to drop out of the normal courses of their lives.
Now, without treading on people's personal stories, I do know that, well, we all know that the discussion about mental health is back in the media. We have with the treatment of Jesse Jackson Jr. We also have with the Chicago Bears player Brandon Marshall coming out. Tell me, Temple, what do you think, especially with your personal experiences regarding with mental health and the stigma, how does this kind of help bring out the message?
Before the taping started, we talked about my history with depression. I'm a depression survivor. I've dealt with it since age 13, and it's taken me almost 30 years to be comfortable sharing what I just shared, especially on television. I would never do that.
And why do you think that is?
Stigma. And I know within with African American and within our culture, often we're taught to be super women and to be strong. It was always whispered about.
Yeah.
And so now I make it a point to, I've started in the last year, really becoming more vocal about my personal story so that I can let others know that with assistance, things can be just fine. There are times when depression will become chronic if it's situational, and so it's beyond I won't say no one, but I didn't choose depression. I didn't choose to be depressed, and so I believe it is hereditary, and also it is, excuse me, depending on communities in terms of stress factors, which Dr. Bell is good with talking about violence and preventive factors. We need awareness.
Right.
Temple, I think yours is such a powerful story, and congratulations for your willingness to share your story, because I think that's going to make it easier for others to seek help. I can't help but think about, as we recently learned of the death of Senator McGovern, who, when he was running for president, selected Senator Eagleton as his vice presidential running mate 40 years ago this year. And the fear of mental illness resulted in Senator Eagleton dropping off the ticket, and that he was a survivor of depression was seen as something that disqualified him from full leadership. I think that was a crime at the time, and fortunately 40 years later we're making progress. We're not there yet, but you're willing to tell your story. I think it's great that the congressman is sharing the news of his diagnosis and his treatment. We have a long way to go, but stigma kills. If we must encourage people to get treatment.
Let's talk about the stigma of the mental illness. Do you think that a lot of times that it's kind of like we are saying one thing, but then we think another, right? So we'll say, I've dealt with depression, I've dealt with some compulsive disorder, whatever the case may be. But then if we categorize it and say, oh, I've been dealing with mental illness, immediately everyone starts thinking the very far extreme demonstrations, right? Something from Psycho or things of that nature. Do you think that kind of plays into the mentality of exactly how we conceptualize mental illness? And then also I want to talk about the cognitive dissonance that comes with the discussion about mental illness. Larry?
Yes. What we find on our college campus wellness center, which is our counseling center, is that students come in when the balance between stigma and the pain and frustration they're going through is tipped such that the pain is greater at that moment than the stigma. That's when they get help. But if
That's a very good point. You said when the pain is greater than the stigma.
Right. If the stigma is really high, preventing them from getting help, then they're only coming in when the pain is really, really high. If the stigma and whatever prevents them from getting help is less, they come in earlier in the process before they've become difficult for themselves, for others, lost opportunities perhaps. treatment is easier, it's quicker, and at that point, we're really talking about things that most of us experience sooner or later. Anxiety, depression, and the things we talk about as mental illness are exaggerations of normal responses that we all make.
It's a healthcare issue.
Right.
So many healthcare issues, the sooner people get help, the less pain they have to go through, but also the easier it is to address.
Right, and that's why the availability is so important, because if you have a source right around the corner, you're going to get there more quickly than if there's another obstacle because the source is across town, if it costs money, if there's a long waiting list. And that's during that time people may deteriorate, they may lose jobs, they may lose student status, they may lose family, and so forth.
It's a domino effect.
Exactly, and then that starts a crescendo of spiraling downward, where their behavior makes things worse, and the worse things get, the worse their individual responses are.
And Temple, you wanted to add?
And also, it sort of goes back to how we started the conversation. Looking at me, probably from with the visible eye, you wouldn't assume anything's, in my history, whatever. However, if someone's talking to himself or there's signs of schizophrenia and other very visible signs of mental illness, then it's easier to see how that person needs help. But there are a lot of people who are silently suffering because that threshold, that pain hasn't reached the point that you were referring to, Dr.
Exactly.
And so they are the ones who are parenting kids, and then these kids are dealing with their own anger management because mama is angry and the children in the home are.
And let's just be honest. A lot of times when we talk about, it's not this encapsulated experience. I always say, these are perilous times. People are losing their jobs, people are losing their homes, people are, I think for us that are 40 and above, we're dealing with taking care of the parents. So now we're taking on the role of the parent for our, you know what I'm saying? We're taking care of our parents and things of that nature. These are really stressful times. I wonder, however, I don't wonder. I think a lot of people have been lying to themselves about mental illness. And no offense to anyone on the panel, I often feel that mental illness is kind of like obesity. Everyone is obese. Everyone has no one has the right body mass index and all of these things of nature. And I'm wondering if that, the way that we have been so successful to talk about obesity and what does it mean to have good health care and how to take care of yourself nutritionally, is that the conversation we need to have with mental health?
Look what's happened to cancer. As we're becoming more and more comfortable, and discussions of breast cancer or other kinds of cancer wouldn't have happened in the past. Those illnesses face the same issues of stigma. We've fought those battles fairly effectively. We need to fight the same battle against stigma with regard to mental illness.
Well, let's what are some things that are described as mental illness? We've heard depression. What else?
Something that I've done research. I was working on a book project. It's on hold, but it deals with perinatal and postpartum mood disorders.
Which is very real, my friends.
It is. And for example, even if a woman miscarries, and does not give birth, that woman may experience a mood disorder that will last up to 2-3 years, I believe it is. You don't have to deliver a child to be impacted in terms of your hormones. And so I believe there are lots of women who they don't even know that they're at risk in terms of mood disorders. And if you've ever had, for example, an issue with mental, just depression, once you become pregnant, your chances more than double in terms of it becoming a perinatal or perinatal mood disorder. So that means you have to really watch your pregnancy. And so there are lots of reasons why, and I would think a husband or a partner would need to know that information. So men need to be aware
but
of those.
sometimes
those
even the
stats
husband
as
and
well.
partners also need assistance in dealing with as well too. I think a lot of people try to suffer in silence. One of the conversations I would love for us to steer into is to talk about how people try to self-medicate. People try to self-treat. One of the things that I will try to carefully disclose is I remember after I had a tumultuous undergraduate experience, I came home and I was, for lack of a better word, I was out of it. There was no self-medication with drugs or anything of that nature, but I know in some communities, especially in Black communities, a lot of times what will happen is that mental illness, whether it's depression, whether it's whatever kind of disorder it may be, it's always identified as something that needs to be preyed upon. You know, we got to pray it out of you. But my parents, as religious as they were, it wasn't that kind of role. They took a very loving approach. They kind of took a very hands-off approach. Okay, let us work through it, things of that nature. Can we talk to the audience about what does it mean to self-diagnose and self-treat? And how dangerous is that? Larry, especially with Larry. Because some people will say, I'm going to deal with it, because some people will say, well, I'm just going to go to church on Sunday and I'm going to pray on it.
Right. Well, churches provide a very important part, I think, of our, in a sense, mental health delivery system because of the support they afford the people who are there. But sometimes some people with certain kinds of issues find some people at some churches too judgmental for their own taste, and they prefer to go to other services, such as a mental health counselor. Other people turn to substance abuse of some type. Alcohol, smoking weed. These usually make people feel better for
a time.
For a brief time.
And let's be honest, the alcohol and marijuana are the preferred self-medications.
Right. For a brief time, but in the long run, they become destructive. But people tend to act in their short-term interests, forgetting about the long-term negative consequences.
Let's take it back to the broader picture about Illinois. So, John, the Illinois mental health system, is it broken?
I think I'd hesitate to use the word broken. It's not adequately meeting the needs of the people.
Okay.
So maybe we're saying the same thing, because I think that what is being provided is effective, but there is not enough service available. It's not available in every community the way it should be available, and there are obstacles in the way of payment. In some cases, Medicaid will cover services. In some cases, it won't. I have some hope for what might come as a result of the Affordable Care Act that will be fully implemented in 2014. But in the meantime, we always used to say that care needs to be affordable, acceptable, and available. Well, it's not always available, and it may or may not be affordable. Where I do think that we have some pretty good success is making it acceptable, in that there's a full understanding of individual differences, cultural differences, making services available in languages other than English, making services available regardless of citizenship status. So I think that the system is doing some things very well. You may have read about some of the changes in the state-funded system, including the closing of Tinley Park Hospital and soon the closing of Singer Mental Health Center in Peoria. The planning that's going on that includes mental health consumers and their family members and others in determining how should those communities be equipped to meet the needs when those hospitals aren't available. There's some very creative thinking going on. Ironically enough, the care that's being offered in those communities, I would wish to see that available in every part of the state, in every neighborhood in the city of Chicago and across the state. So we know what works, what's being provided does work. There's just not enough of it, and people can't get to it.
But you know, considering the relationship and the lack of, well, let's rewind. what concerns me most about when we talk about the ability to have a healthcare system that can mitigate mental health, mental illness, and treatment, it seems like such an oxymoron. Because at one point we're talking about, well, when people are mentally ill, they need to find a place that a provider that they can trust. They need to be somewhere that's accessible. But then we turn right around, and it seems as if that we find the facilities that people have relied on the most, such as Tinley Park, such as the 6 centers that were closed in Chicago. Doesn't that kind of put the thumb on the weight scale of you're making things worse, Larry?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the things that happens is many people get to the point where the illness itself may prevent them from getting treatment. This is often the case of people who become homeless. There are programs in Chicago that seek out these people and offer treatment, but typically they refuse. They're at such a point of fear and suspicion that they refuse the treatment. Many of these practitioners then return time and time again. They may visit a particular homeless person who tends to hang out in a certain area. They may visit them 50, 100 times before they can engage them in any kind of treatment. And even then, what the person really wants is a place to sleep and a job. They're not looking for mental health treatment per se.
And that is, we've had this discussion in my office before, that housing, and that's another layer, of course.
Let's go there.
But I honestly believe when we're judging folks or examining this discussion in terms of mental health, we need to look at homelessness and or does the person have a safe environment in terms of where he or she is staying? And if they're recently released from the penal system or juvenile system, then that living situation may not be stable.
And let's talk about the veterans when they come home and the access to resources that they need as well.
And so housing becomes a top priority. And although the person may recognize that, there's a need for mental health services, that housing becomes the major issue.
Is housing the priority because in treating mental illness, especially in the most severe cases, it's one of the platforms is you need to provide stability. There has to be some type of stable framework somewhere.
Because they could be a trigger, right? You want to avoid triggers.
Housing, adequate nutrition, just a stable environment. And I would like to mention that at the Wellness Center, which is staffed in part by the wonderful students from the Chicago school where John is, the typical response of our students who are mainly from middle class, upper middle class families, when they encounter our students who are from the more poor neighborhoods of Chicago, they all admire how well they do under the circumstances. And everybody says, I don't know that I could do as well as they do if I had these kinds of challenges. And resilience is the word that comes up again and again. But yet there are some people, everybody has their breaking point. And some people, these particular challenges they take them out of the game. But with support, mental health support and all kinds of social services, these people stay in the game, they succeed, they become productive, and they provide for their families, and they stop that cycle.
Well, we're down to our last 3 minutes, and I want to bring this point out in our closing. As we're talking, I keep hearing the lyrics of Bob Marley, and he's talking about Babylon makes the rules and everyone will suffer. And I'm thinking about the Illinois legislators and the decisions that are made at Chicago, and there seems to be this sense of cognitive dissonance. And I want to know, in our closing remarks, what is the advice that you would give? Because we're talking from the ground level on what should you do if you're on the ground level, but what expectations should we be making of our policymakers? Starting with Temple, and then we'll round out with John.
You know, I just say,
we got 2 minutes.
Please I would like for them to put themselves in the position of these families and people who are on the front line, like both our doctors here and educators. We're on the front line as well. We encounter a lot of challenges related to mental health. And so just understand that we all pay. We all suffer. We're all impacted negatively and positively.
And then real quick, Larry, and then John.
I mentioned before how substance abusers think in terms of the short term, not the long term. I would like the legislatures to invest in the long term, which is to give money to these kinds of programs.
John.
I think that legislators need to know that these people who are in their communities, in their districts, are those who are living with mental illness and other related issues. I had a wonderful experience taking a young man named Michael from Berwyn and his mother Sandra to the legislature. Michael testified to a committee, but then we walked around to legislative offices, and the light bulbs that were going on for the legislators as they talked to a 16-year-old boy with mental illness. They had not made the connection. These are folks, these are their neighbors, these are their constituents, these are folks in every neighborhood of the city and the full state, and that mental health has to be a priority. It's a tough time financially, but mental health has to be toward the top of the priorities.
And I would say that, you know, I definitely wish Jesse Jackson Jr. a speedy recovery. And within that recovery, I hope he becomes the strongest advocate that we have ever seen when it comes to addressing mental health. And that's our show for today. Join us next time on The Professors.